Hello and welcome to a special episode. Now that I've played through the releases of Zero and Azure and replayed the Sky games, it is time to create a top 9 list of the Legends of Hero games, the Trails series. Top 9 since I haven't played part 10 Reverie yet. The main focus will be on characters and story, and that means I won't go all that much into game mechanics. The core of it stayed the same, and while new things were added, that didn't change anything about the tactical fights at its core. That means I won't hold the changes in the magic system starting with Cold Steel against the series, although that would be fair, but it also will mean I won't praise minor upgrades like the fishing mechanics that changed for the better with Cold Steel. I also don't think I have to give many extra points for the graphics, since yes, the graphics are better in the Cold Steel series, they have a new graphic engine, but Falcom did a lot of impressive stuff with the old graphics that are way simpler, and I don't think they did anything all that amazing with the new stuff. They have better graphics, but they haven't mastered them yet. I also want to point out, at this point, I will talk about it later too, but I need to point out the Cold Steel games give a lot of character development and even plot in bonding scenes. And you either have to choose or reload a lot. So this does a big disservice to the narrative. And I might not mention it in every installment of the Cold Steel series, but it's a lingering thing in the background for all the 4 games. And now, without delaying this any further, since this will be long enough as it is, here is the top 9 the Legends of Hero games, the Trails series. Number 9. Trails of Cold Steel Part 1. On the bottom of this list, Trails of Cold Steel Part 1 was a game I was rather hyped for after playing 3 Trails in the Sky games. We start a new arc in Erebonia. The simplified version is Erebonia is more or less in the same state as Germany in the 1870s. A more or less wise emperor, a chancellor who is running the show, and nobles who basically are still in power but lose influence. The noble and reformist factions clash rather hard at this point in time, and in the midst of this, Prince Olivier is forming Class 7. He is doing that at the prestigious Taurus Military Academy and actively mixing young persons from the two factions together. And the plan here is to get past the divide and create something he refers as a third path. We start the game with Ween riding the train to Taurus Military Academy, and after this brief introduction of our protagonists, which really didn't give us much to work with, we continue by dropping all the other 8 people of the main cast who will join Ween in Class 7 on us at once. That was not a smart move. We get as a representation of the current divide in Erebonia 2 characters in our group who are at each other's throats from the get-go. One noble and one reformist. Incidentally, how much of a problem is it really? Less than 30% of our own class seems to have strong feelings about this, and aside from some scenes with NPCs that are only there to push the issue, most of the time people didn't seem to be on the edge about this at all. We also get a cringeworthy introduction to what will be the canon love interest of our protagonist, and afterwards we get an overview how every chapter of the game will proceed. If you thought the previous games could be formulaic at times, this game really takes the cake in this regard. Starting with classes, giving you some free time in the school town Twister to mainly push the hero mechanic with bonding points and scenes, which as mentioned does the narrative flow a huge disservice, and afterwards we'll go on a field study. The field studies feel like the free roaming parts of the previous games, and the tasks are very much like we still play bracers instead of students. For these field studies, the big class is divided into 2 groups to help the player handle the huge cast. They also wanted you to focus more on some specific ones, which makes sense. You need to develop them as soon as possible after the clumsy introduction. One of the first trips is all about trying to solve the dispute of the 2 adversaries, and by that showing some kind of leadership skills of our protagonist Reen. Solving the dispute part leads to the 2 at least working together if needed. The leadership part failed since Reen just doesn't feel like a leader at all. He is way more occupied with his own self-doubts. To a degree he can't really care about anything else, let alone lead this group. We get back after this chapter just to find out another pair of people is at each other's throats. This time instead of 2 boys, it's 2 girls. Worse even, it's for a non-reason if I ever heard one. After these stupid first 2 chapters, I needed a break. I actually needed to pause for a week. I just wasn't used to trails being this poor. Thinking about it, one of the main things that bugged me was the protagonist. Adding to that, the group around me had almost no interesting character and were surfly underwritten. The drama between them felt very artificial, and all the interactions happen purely through our protagonist. That's another strange decision. In other games, there was stuff going on between other characters, without the protagonist as a moderator standing there and holding hands. Here, even if people hang out with each other, it's always just to talk to Reen as a team. Anyway, at the end of the school year, the students of Class 7 have allegedly become good friends, and we discover some artificial mech that bonds with Reen. Shortly afterwards, civil war breaks out, which seems a bit much. It just didn't feel like it would escalate this quickly. And after the group is forced to split up, the game ends on a cliffhanger. A very poor cliffhanger. Number 8. Trails of Cold Steel Part 2. Still hoping the game would be a jump in quality over its first part, Trails of Cold Steel didn't deliver at all. With the end of the last game, we shifted from the classic school setting into the midst of a civil war. At least that should shake things up, but whatever goodwill I had with the second part was destroyed right in the first chapter, where you have to recollect your scattered classmates, reintroducing them in smaller groups, which was already an improvement to the first part. You also have 3 big battles in the first chapter, which, after you won them, will lead to a scene where your opponent stands up, effortlessly defeats you, and you will be rescued by some of your associates who are stronger and more experienced than you, just to hammer down how inept you are. This repetitive cycle gets annoying really fast and led to my second I need a break moment. Especially the last section, the escape from the Pantragul, which was meant to be a mirror from Estelle's escape from the Glorious, did stretch my patience over its limit. That whole sequence was so dumb, I again needed a break afterwards. The game gets a lot better after its first chapter, giving you much more freedom in moving around and choosing your next step. There are a lot more mech battles in this one, and they get old very fast. Instead of interesting tactical battles where positioning matters, we have 2 chunks of metal hitting each other till one runs out of health. What a downgrade. In the end, the civil war ends, and all we have achieved in 2 long games is to kind of establish Erebonia and a few characters at the most basic level. Having a weak protagonist like Reen wasn't helping in the slightest. We get some special connections between our heroes, if I may use the term lightly, and the villains, which hint on future conflict potential, and then Class 7 disband. What should be an emotional moment really didn't work at all for me, because aside from Elliot, Fee and Millium, none of the characters were all that interesting for me. Reen was just dead weight, and if I would ever see any of them again, I could have lived with that. Best part of the game is the epilogue, where we are allowed to play as Lloyd and Wixia, and it felt so nice kicking the crap out of Reen in that one fight. That's mainly why this one is above part 1. And now a short intermission. Before I go on, I just have to say these two games are not only at the bottom of the list, compared to all the rest, they are of a lower quality level, period. What should have been done is remove most of the bonding system, since it's not going anywhere until part 4 anyway, focus more on the story and reduce these two games to one game instead. It still wouldn't be great, but at least wouldn't stand out as the low point of the series that much. Now, back to the list. Number 7. Trails of Cold Steel Part 3. Now at this point it might seem I dislike the Cold Steel series as a whole, so let me start with saying this one is already on another level quality-wise. Looking at Cold Steel as a whole, I think the writing and characters are way weaker compared to the rest. It's not like I'm talking about bad games, even the other two did have their moments. So as I said, let's start with the fact that this is a huge improvement over the two previous parts. The old Class 7, which was the main cast in part 1 and 2, moves into a more supportive role, and we get a new Class 7, which starts out small with 3 people and gets 2 additional members later. Somebody might have remembered how characters have been introduced in the first 5 games, and since that worked out way better, got back to the roots. Since there are less characters overall, we can spend more time to actually get to know them a little. We are back to the school setting, and this is Thor's Military Academy Branch campus, which gets the classes 7, of course, to 9. Also attending Thor's Military Academy Branch is Tida, our tech girl from Trails in the Sky. And that already made me happy, even though she is not part of Class 7. Just to mention this, we meet another character from a previous game in the pawn shop. And I didn't know her at the time I played this, but Jingo has from the get-go more personality than most of Cold Steel's regulars. Imagine that! Ween is now in a new role as a teacher, which makes sense, he graduated last year, so moving on to teaching this fast is completely normal. I mean, Tova is also teacher here, and she was only 1 year ahead of him. Also, wasn't she supposed to be some kind of prodigy? A small teaching job like this makes little sense as a career choice. We also get Randolph from the Crossbell arc as the 3rd teacher, and at least he has the right background to be a teacher at a military academy. That means we are spicing up the cast with some well-known characters, which is a good thing. The characters of Cold Steel didn't make that much of an impact so far. After the civil war from the first 2 parts is behind us, we now are moving towards a real war. World War style. Right off the bat, this part gets dragged down by being influenced heavily on events that happened between part 2 and 3 off screen. So we had 2 long games, and the more impactful stuff that especially influences our protagonists happened off screen. The story moves forward and our heroes have almost zero impact on things, just reacting to the problem at hand. Story-wise, this is showing just how far ahead with their plan our antagonists are, while it's still not clear what the end goal really is. This could be a great game and story with that kind of setup, if we had a better protagonist. But we still get almost nothing from Ween, and that's by design, since his special role for the Cold Steel story as a whole makes it at least part impossible to delve into him and his backstory too much. So it always feels like he lacks personality, and that doesn't seem to be any character motivation other than protecting the people around him. He never lets loose, and him being just a tool for the story counter to the story being about him is dragging down the whole Cold Steel arc. We also try to use the connections between some of our heroes and some of our villains, like it was used in Trails in the Sky 2nd chapter or in the Crossbell arc. Here, this isn't really getting off the ground, which again comes back to so many of the way too big casts being heavily underwritten. Nothing comes close to the deep connections of Sherazade with Luciola, or the whole Ren story, or even the Vasi Vault connection. The only thing that was somehow working is Yusu's struggle with the actions of his brothers alongside his deeper connections to Millium. Didn't think he was the only one of old Class 7 who actually gets something of an arc. Funny enough, that doesn't even include Marias. The final cliffhanger here is good on paper, but the emotional connections to the characters still just isn't there. The only shocking part was the unclear fate of Olivier. Well, unclear on paper at least. And that's only because he is a well-established character we knew for very long at this point. The other thing that really worked was the rather cruel fate of Milliam. The cliffhanger around Ween wasn't very effective, since after 3 games with Ween, I was extremely indifferent about his face after getting captured. I kind of wanted him to be out of the picture to make room for somebody else. Number 6. Trails in the Sky, the third. Compared to every other game, this one was very different. We get an interesting new protagonist with Kevin, and this game is about him, his backstory, and how the guilt he feels of past events shaped its current character. And in the end, leads to the situation the cast of Trails in the Sky is in. He now has to sort out his past and the guilt he feels, come clean towards his friends around him, especially Reese, the new character introduced in this game. At the end, he will realize that his past actions weren't really things he could have controlled and gets over the darkness that was crushing him. A solid story. At its core, this is a dungeon crawler. The side quests have been more or less replaced with the doors that give you stories, backstories and minigames. Some of them are quite significant, some are pure fanservice. But in the end, this replaces the world building that was a strong point for every other game in a very different fashion. The characters are introduced very methodically. We get some time with Kevin alone, then a longer period with him and Reese to learn more about our protagonist and protagonist and get a first hint about their history. Later, when the dungeon crawler begins, all the cast from Trails in the Sky is getting reintroduced, one by one, and since many of them get some more backstory inside some of the doors, we get a rather good understanding for most of them. The fights are mostly very interesting, and having to use all your characters in the final dungeon was a great idea. Some of the more memorable fights would be the encounter with Cassia's bride and the final goodbye to Löw. If I had to point out the more important stuff, I would point to the continuation of the Ren story and showing Alan Richards' new workplace, so there is a door left open for him to play a bigger role in the future. The big goodbye at the end of Trails in the Sky is a bittersweet moment that closes out the Sky arc in a great way. At this point, I realized how much I would miss this great cast of characters. Number 5. Trails in the Sky First Chapter. While my personal connection with this game is rather deep and the constant complaints of the bad pacing is in my opinion a little exaggerated, there's no denying this part has some problems in that department. Trails in the Sky is the first part of the first major story arc in the Trails series. It had to set up everything. The steampunk-esque setting, the characters and the world. If you take everything it had to do into account, it's no wonder it seems slow at times. The characters have never been introduced this clean in any other part of the series. We get a glance at the playable characters before we can really use him later on as part of our group. We get quite a lot of backward information about every single one of them, and getting to know them well enough to understand their position and thoughts. Unless they are hiding something, in that case we get a reveal later on. The two main characters, Estelle and Joshua, are the gold standard of main characters. The energetic but naive Estelle and the cool and collected Joshua build a pair that complements each other. This part is about their bracer journey, and Estelle especially. We see the girl with little knowledge of the world going through all the challenges and foiling a coup d'etat at the end. She's relying deeply on her partner Joshua, and there's also the blooming of romantic feelings towards him. All those things are handled really well, but are in the end only the setup for the second chapter. Pacing-wise, the game has some issues. But I never felt them as hard as other players, to be honest. The beginning is rather slow, and even if you take into account they want to give you time to understand the mechanics and explore a lot, I have to admit this is not ideal. Again, talking about the pacing, we get some kind of intermission in a later chapter where our two heroes attend a school for some time. And while that was entertaining in itself, it still felt like hitting the pause button. So there are some things that really don't feel like they are proper pacing. The game itself ends on a hell of a cliffhanger. It completely flips the board over in record time, leaving you with a desire to see the next part. Number 4. Trails of Cold Steel Part 4. The final of the Erebonian arc is both a great triumph in showing how many great characters we have accumulated in the whole series, and also rather telling when you realize how little of the good characters are from Trails of Cold Steel. They really pulled all the stops. Having a prologue where we get the Bright family minus Cassius, the Benning family and Ellie as playable characters. Sadly we can't stay with the good guys, but we are spared Wien as a protagonist for the first chapter of this game, which also gets this game a +1 rating. All good things must come to an end though, so we finally see the endgame of the villains unfold and our core team of heroes work against it, for real this time. After little more than 3 parts we finally have a plan to actually fight back and not just stumble around. It also means we finally have a plot in these games. On the global stage a world war is coming, but even that is just a stage for the real plan of the villains, which involves a lot of mech fighting, since the main idea is to beat all the other special mechs to absorb their powers and become Voltron or something. It's not helping that the mech fights still are just as boring as ever. 2 hunks of metal hitting each other, as opposed to the normal fights where movement and positioning added a tactical layer to the fights. I was quite irritated when I found out that at one point they referred to the events from the Ring of Justice manga. It would have been great if they retold that story as a flashback with some pictures. Even better, have us play that in a bonus section. Why not? I'm not just saying this because anything I can play that doesn't involve Wien is a plus at this point. The promotional manga this was taken from is rather obscure, and I think even long-time players will not have known about it. Anyway, after running around in all of Western Erebonia, since the eastern part aside from Crossbell is not available even in this final, we are finally finishing the saga by getting to the bottom of the mystery. We get our final dungeon and we try to have this nice idea where some of our heroes have special ties to some of the villains, like Sherazade with Luciola in Trails in the Sky or Randolph had with Siegmund in From Zero to Azure. But most of these don't seem to matter, probably depending on whose bonding scenes you bother to watch. But mostly because none of this is set up all that well, with one exception. Lucius, a rather dislikable character at start, was developed rather well in parts 3 and 4, and the final battle with his brother actually meant something. In the final we defeat the main villain, which leads to the just started world war coming to an end. The emotional final celebration was the marriage of Olivier and Sherazade. Since you couldn't give Wien an emotional send-off, you didn't even know which one of his harem he would end up with. Finally, the damn harem thing is coming to an end and some kind of conclusion. And by now, Wien is potentially dating 11 girls. Among them, 3 of his students. As he is still their teacher, one of them, his former teacher, who also has stated she likes older men, so no clue why she was involved, and his stepsister. All those are not mentions here are kind of weird for me. Especially his stepsister. Estelle and Joshua met at the age of 10 and 11. They were well aware by that point in time they weren't related. And it's also helpful visually, they didn't look anything alike. And besides, Estelle having this idea that he might be seen as a brother. Nobody else had that idea, by the way. There was no hint these two could be related. There's also another thing to mention. Adopting your future son-in-law is not uncommon in Japanese culture. So this pairing was totally fine for me. Ween and Elise have been living as brother and sister since Ween was 5 and Elise was 3 years old. And they look like siblings. So that pairing, while technically not incest, was really an odd choice for me. This one has a through ending you can get after a fake ending. And I really don't know why that was done for the first time. It didn't really add anything, and if he wouldn't have to sacrifice Millium for that fake ending, I would have preferred it. Since it would have meant Ween was gone forever. Yes, I'm at that point. Cold Steel as a whole was a mess, and this part is only this high because of all the reoccurring characters from former games, and since it finally seems to have a plot. In parts we even get some very special character moments like the continuation of Wen's story or some further aspects of the Hamel disaster. The main cast, and by this I mean mostly the baggage of part 1 and 2, wouldn't have made it alone. Then there is the epic scope with the World War. We have almost every nation we know at this point involved, and the man himself, Cassius Bright, as the strategic commander of one of the war factions. Even if it was a rough ride to get here, this final is really good. Number 3. Trails from Zero. Normally the first part of a storyline has it rough. You have to set up a new nation on Zemuria's continent, new protagonists, new characters, a new story arc. And getting a fulfilling ending is normally not in the cards of the first parts. The best you can hope for is a good cliffhanger. Zero is different. The story of Lloyd Bennings and his special support section starts off with a cliffhanger, sort of, but you wouldn't know it at this point. The main characters are introduced fast and we get to know a thing or two about them while playing. But the first impression already tells you so much of either of them, it's kind of amazing. Aside from the main storyline, we also get the continuation of a Trails in the Sky storyline, The Hunt for Ren, giving us our favorite Bracer as part of the cast. There's a reason why this is called Trails in the Sky Part 4 at times. And we get a very satisfying ending for this one. Lloyd took his detective exam and returned to Crossbell. His brother, who was also a police detective, was shot, and alongside his other tasks, finding a murderer of his brother is one of his motivations to be here. Crossbell is a very interesting setting. Between two nations that both want to claim the city and the surrounding land for themselves, we have a lot of corruption, and since legislation is limited due to the special status, an El Dorado for criminal activities, granting the city the nickname City of Sin. The special support section is doing Bracer-esque tasks in Crossbell, since the police has a bad reputation, while the Bracers are the heroes of the public. So the plan is to get points with the populace by being helpful like the Bracers. Weird, but I get it. As they delve deeper into the depravity and corruption of Crossbell, our heroes save the young girl Kia and find the remainder of a rather twisted cult called D, therefore G. That was supposed to be dismantled in a joint operation led by Cassius Bright himself, and you know things are serious when Papa Bright takes over. While Zero is setting up the pieces for part 2, it would also be a story of its own. The ending is solid, and while some questions remain unanswered, the player will be rather satisfied with the ending he got. This one is truly one of the best stories the series had. Clean, fast-paced, with a lot of humor, and it's only part 1 of a bigger story. Number 2. Trails to Azure. The story picks up from the end of Zero. The special support section gets 2 new members, both of them were already available as guest characters in part 1. Now Vasi and Noel are full members of the squad. 2 of our members are absent for a while to give the 2 new ones more breathing room. After the events of Zero, we still have Kia around our police officers. Aside from that, it's business as usual. After Zero, things have changed in Crossbill. The corrupt politicians lost their jobs or are in jail. The Italian-style mafia is gone, the Eastern-style criminal syndicate is still here though. We get a new mayor for Crossbill and he has big plans. There is a big trade conference with all major countries, and at the end of it he even announces his big plan for independence for Crossbill. The characters are still top in this part, and there are a lot of well-liked people from Trails in the Sky who show up in Crossbill too. Among them Chloe, Olivier, Kevin, Reese. The list is quite long and pretty awesome. Similar to Trails of Cold Steel 4, they really made some calls to get more people in here. I think some of the drama between the heroes and the villains, like the pairing Walt and Varzi or Rixie and Shirley, were a bit rushed. Still better than almost anything they tried in Cold Steel in that regard, but since there's so much going on in this part, some corners had to be cut, I guess. Story-wise, this is a perfect drama. We can see in the first part how things really come together. After the rocky start our new formed group had in Zero, they are now an established part of Crossbill and everyone's life seems to get better through them. There are some dark clouds like Wendy's family showing up and the difficult political situation for Crossbill between 2 big nations that would like to occupy them rather sooner than later, if it wasn't for the other one. But even that gets addressed and there might be a chance to solve it. This goes well up to the point where everything falls apart. And fast. People get hurt, buildings get destroyed, allies turn to adversaries, and everything goes down the drain. In the grand final, we pick up all the broken pieces and try to make things right again. At least as much as we can. Boss fights in this part are a little on the repetitive side. I explained in my video where I defeat the end boss how you only need one strategy for most of them. And actually any other strategy might not even work. I didn't really mention the boss fights for the other games since, aside from Sky the Third, where they are more the focus and are quite good, for the most part we get solid action and can use a variety of strategies to get the job done. In this one that was not quite it. While the ending is a bit on the bittersweet side, it still is very satisfying. Crossbill was also a great setting for the story. The city and its surrounding felt really alive. Number 1. Trails in the Sky, 2nd chapter. I say it right at the start, this is my favorite game. Period. When I was playing the first part and reached the cliffhanger, this was not available. And I was devastated. And was hyped for the second part for over a year. My expectations were quite high, and normally that's not a good thing, since the game might not live up to them. Then I got my hands on it, and well, it exceeded expectations. We start right where we left off. Joshua is gone, and Estelle is devastated. Once home in the faint hope he's waiting for her, but has to realize that's not the case. She meets Kevin Graham on the way, who would be the protagonist of the 3rd Sky game, and after realizing that getting Joshua back will be way more complicated, she matures, decides she first needs more training, and she trained in a special boys facility. Back in LeBeau, she leads her companions through one crisis after another, while never leaving her main goal out of sight, getting Joshua back. That tenacity and compassion made her push through anything, and ultimately even stop the plans of wise men, who had way greater resources at hand than our young bracers at any given time. The villains are so far ahead with their plan, all Estelle can do for the most part is damage control, reacting to the next test, the next phase of the plan. Things change as society finally starts the end phase of their plan. As a character, Estelle was already very enjoyable in the first part, but her character journey in this one is one of a kind. Estelle wasn't some chosen one, not a child prodigy or anything special. She worked hard to become better and earned her victories. There's a reason she is called Bestel. Her escape from the Glorious and her reuniting with Joshua is one of the high notes of this episode. Many of the side quests give the world so much more depth, and the special connections between some of the heroes and the villains are very effective and focused side stories. And in terms of Ren, a huge storyline that even in Cold Steel 4 still isn't completely finished. Opposite to first chapter, this part is fast paced. First chapter sacrificed a lot to set up this part perfectly, but the payoff is well worth it. This is a masterpiece, and I actually replayed Trails in the Sky after I finished Cold Steel to see if it's not just nostalgia that makes me appreciate these more than the newer stuff. It so isn't. This is as good as it gets with the Trails series. And with Estelle and Joshua setting off to new adventures, it has a very satisfying ending. You can truly see how these heroes become legends. So, there we are. My rank from 9 to 1, and with the next part available this summer, I'll probably have more to talk about this soon enough. For now, we are at the end. What's your ranking of the games? Leave a comment and tell me about it.